since we already got about 70 participants, and we also got participants in YouTube Lives too. So shall we start, Ms. Katheryn? Okay, then.
That's great, thank you.
Good morning to all of our dear participants. Hello, welcome to the last day of IRUD summer course, but believe me, the last wouldn't be the least. We are here with another very interesting, very particular topic and a very notable speaker. Firstly, let me introduce myself. I am Areta Ardita Putri and I will be your moderator for today. Today, it will have the theme of education quality in social disparities. As we know, quality education is a part of SDGs, and it is a basic need for people. Before we start, I would like to remind to you all once again, yes, please do turn on your camera and join us with your audio. These are necessary for the attendance requirements since you will also be monitored throughout the session. I would also like to remind you to please be careful with your mic as to make sure the session to go smoothly for you and for us. For any requirement or any inquiries, you can communicate our PIC1. Our PIC1 name started with the terms PIC1, which include myself, Areta, Grace, and Beatrix. You can look for their name. Okay, now let's move on to the speaker of today, which is Ms. Katheryn. She is a woman which leads in educational system from UNICEF in Indonesia. So for the operator, would you please give us the CV? Yes, thank you very much, our operator. So once again, to the speaker would be Ms.Katheryn Bennett. She is a leading member of an education team and program in a complex middle-income country context like Indonesia and Phnom Penh, which is Cambodia. She has given delivery of education quality improvement programs with subnational government to assist children in particularly disadvantaged area, including those are in and out of school. She also advocates build policy and build corporation in the name for aid for children. She has done many programs for a leading strategic planning for children to realize their rights to an inclusive, equitable, relevant, and quality education. So she has involved herself in many dialogues and many advocacy for children's rights. And she has worked in several places like ASEAN Pacific region, UNESCO, Thailand, World Bank, and of course, here now in Indonesia. We do know that Australia and Indonesia has cooperation agreement in terms of education sector from Ms. Katheryn herself, which her home country is actually Australia. She has also participated in several projects to implement education quality and governance components of Australia basic education program to Indonesia. Well, as you can see from her CV, I have read several, maybe a little visualization of her work experience. Well, if you read it a bit, her experience is actually a bit of my dream. Not a bit, actually. It's kind of my dream in the future. It is once again an honor to be able to be her moderator today. Thank you very much, Katheryn. Thank you very much for being here. So maybe that is all that I could do to introduce her. So please, I do hope you could explain more about your work in terms of the development of children's quality of education. So here and now for Ms. Katheryn Bennett, or it's an honor to be able to call you Katheryn. So for Katheryn, thank you very much. And please do greet the audience for today. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Areta. And it's very lovely to see people joining today. I understand we have people joining from all over Indonesia and probably beyond Indonesia. So I feel very happy to have had an opportunity to come and share some thoughts with you today. And I hope that the presentation that I'm giving today will be interesting, and very happy to have some questions at the end. We have filled the presentation with lots of pictures and images, and I hope it is kind of engaging for you. So yeah, very, very happy to join today, and yes, thanks so much, Areta, for the invitation.
Okay, thank you very much, Catherine. Now, shall we start the session of the lecture? For the operator, please to share screen the presentation. And please, Catherine, the time and the screen is truly yours. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you so much. Like I said, it's a great pleasure to be with everyone today. And I want to also just acknowledge before I start the support of my colleague Jaslyn, who's also online, who's really worked hard on putting a lot of pieces together to share with you today as well. The presentation that we are presenting and sharing today is really got a very strong focus on child rights, but in the context of supporting quality education in social disparities. And if we can maybe just go on to the next slide, and I can go through what our proposed speaking agenda is. So Nico, if you don't mind changing the slide, that would be great to number 2.
Excuse me, Mega, would you please?
Is it visible? I have shared the screen.
Yes, it's
please change the slide, can you? If you can make it a full screen, that would be helpful because it would make it easy for people to see. Thank you so much. That's great. Yeah. So the agenda today, we're really going to focus just on 6 areas, and I hope this won't be too long for people. So I'll do my best. But first of all, we're going to just look at aspects of the Convention of the Rights of the Child and how that kind of relates to education. We are going to also be looking a little bit at the sort of global aspects of that, but also the aspects that relate to Indonesia. We're going to take a look at the impact of COVID-19 on the education sector, particularly on what that means for child rights, as well as considering children who are in particularly disadvantaged areas. We are going to do a short reflection on some work that UNICEF has recently done, exploring the digital education landscape in Indonesia. And we're going to just sort of reflect on some results from that work. And then finally, I'm just going to take a moment to share with you UNICEF's programs in education in Indonesia, with a particular focus on the work that we're doing in early grade literacy in Papua and West Papua. So next slide, please, Miga. So we do have I'm proposing some learning goals. I would really like for everyone to be better acquainted with the Convention of the Rights of the Child, Sustainable Development Goals and how they all fit together. Also understanding Indonesia's education landscape and how it relates to core rights around education access and quality. Where are the key gaps, etc., in those data? Building awareness of the impact of the pandemic. Like I said, we will be looking at that, having a session on that, and then just as I said before, having a bit of a chat about UNICEF's work in the education space, particularly in trying to respond to the learning crisis that's been generated by COVID-19. Next slide, please, Miga. So the first important question we have to ask is, what are child rights and why are they important? Next slide, please. So this slide just is a very brief reference to the Convention on the Rights of the Child. The convention was actually adopted in 1989, so it's quite an old standing kind of convention. It is a legally binding instrument, and Indonesia is a signatory to the CRC. I think the important thing is that the Convention on the Rights of the Child, or CRC, recognises the fundamental human dignity of all children and the urgency of ensuring their well-being and development. The convention makes clear the idea that the idea of a basic quality of life should be the right of all children, not just a few privileged. And the child rights approach that you can see here in the slide, there's a little box that says the Arch of Human Rights. And on the left-hand side, we're talking about duty bearers. And then on the right, we're talking about rights holders. So I just want to speak a little bit about this consists of the child rights approach. These components make up that. So the child rights approach consists of two main actors. Firstly, the rights holder, which in the case that we're speaking about is actually the rights of the child, and the duty bearer, who has a responsibility for upholding and facilitating the rights of the child. And there can be different kinds of duty bearers. So these could be parents, they could be teachers, they could be school principals, or they could be very important, decision makers within local communities and so on. So I guess the question is, so how does UNICEF link with this CRC? And basically in the work that we do, we really start the design of our programs with a child rights approach at their centre. So what we do is we start to identify the rights of the child that need to be secured. And the way we do that is we kind of identify key deprivations that children are experiencing, in particular education and country contexts. We then identify bottlenecks or obstacles towards achieving the right to education that children are experiencing. And so, for example, in a particular country context, we might have children who may not be prepared or ready for school. And then we have to say to ourselves, why is that the case? Well, then we may look at the fact that there may be insufficient early childhood education services. And then if that is the case, then we have to ask ourselves, so why is there insufficient early childhood education services? So it might be a lack of trained teachers. It might be the fact that there is not budget prioritisation to support funding the delivery of education, early childhood education or early childhood development services. And it also could be connected to the perception of parents as well. Perhaps in some countries, parents don't necessarily understand the value of early childhood education. So it's also trying to, unpack that as well. So this whole process of unpacking the deprivations and the bottlenecks towards children obtaining their rights to education is known as a causality analysis. And it really does help us get to the root of the problems. And then we can work out how we can address those problems through our programs. If we can move to the next slide, please, Mega, that would be great. So why are child rights important? And you can see there's actually quite a long list of reasons why they are important. Firstly, children are individual human beings. They're not the possession of parents nor of the state. Children start life as totally dependent beings, relying on old adults to guide them to independence. But if adult caregivers are not available to actually nurture them, governments often then have to step in and provide support so that they're able to access alternative care. Government actions impact children more than any other group. And therefore, it's really important from a policy-making perspective that we do consider the interests and the needs of children. And it's not always done. So this is something that UNICEF, as an important advocate for child rights, is working hard to do. The societal crises are often disproportionately felt by children, and this is particularly the situation we have at the moment with COVID-19, where we've had over 600,000 students that were not able to go to school for the last 18 months. So they really are suffering quite significantly. Then also children's healthy development is crucial to a society's well-being and will have a positive impact in the future. So even more reasons to really try to ensure that children can actually exercise their rights. And I think the most important point of all these, I really feel, is that children's earliest experiences often affect them throughout their lives. So if we fail them when they're young, the costs are actually huge to actually get that right. Next slide, please, Miga. So the next next slide is really just trying to give an overview of UNICEF's role in respect to realising the rights of the child. And it's important to note that UNICEF is mandated by the UN General Assembly to advocate for the protection of children's rights. That includes education, a right to education. And UNICEF works across a range of different stakeholders to try to do this, both at global level as well as at country level. And in Indonesia, we are working very closely with different government counterparts to try and generate evidence to inform child-related policies and governance, to strengthen the capacity of key stakeholders involved in ensuring children's welfare, and also providing innovative technical support for child-related policy reform and programming across Indonesia. We have to, the only way we can really do this work is through working with government and other partners. So Miga, if you could change the slide, because the next slide just gives an overview of the role of government in relation to child protection. If you could change the slide, please. Thank you. So UNICEF, you can see here that there are different kinds of activities happening at different levels of government when it comes to trying to promote child protection. So, we are working with district, provincial, national governments, also with civil society organisations to ensure that children are safe and protected, and particularly in relation to education, that they are safe and protected in and out of school, and that this means that they are also able to access quality basic education services. So education is a fundamental, government is a fundamental partner in this work. Next slide, please. So this slide just summarises some of the key legal instruments around the Convention on the Rights of the Child. Well, child rights more broadly, actually. But it also, so we have there the convention at the start, at the top, which is obviously a global legal instrument. We also have reference to the SDGs, which I'll speak about a little bit later. But then under that, we have a series of very high-level legal instruments and regulations that the Indonesian government has introduced. And from a very early time, it goes back to the Indonesian constitution. There's a more current regulation, presidential regulation, linked to the National Medium-Term Development Plan, which has implications for child rights as well, and so on. So what I'd like to do is just to encourage you to take some time to review some of these documents and to become more familiar with some of the legal frameworks that are so important for establishing the foundation of child rights in Indonesia and also globally. Next slide, please. So this slide is starting to, I think, just really focus on what do child rights mean in relation to education. And a lot of, when we talk about human rights or child rights in relation to education, we often use the terminology as education for all. And that means that no child should be left behind. There should always be opportunity for children, whether they're in school or out of school, to actually obtain an education. So the right of access to education is really fundamental. It's really important that we have education services that are accessible, that are equity focused, and also support lifelong learning. So not only as a child, but also as people get older and more progressed in their life, they also can return to education when they feel that it's appropriate for them to do that. The other right that is also really important is the right to quality education. And when we talk about quality, we really do talk about things like relevance and inclusive curriculum. We're also talking about things like, safety and a sort of nurturing and healthy environment, learning environment. So a big part of this is trying to make sure that that we really tackle the violence against children in schools, which is a big issue in the region. and also in Indonesia is an issue here as well. And also that we are really making sure that mental health and psychosocial support is given to children, and particularly at this really tricky time where we've had such long school closures, and there's a lot of stress and anxiety out there amongst children. So really thinking through those things. And the third right I wanted to just reference here is the right to respect in the learning environment. So that's about respecting identity, encouraging participation of young people. It's also about integrity as well, so that we are teaching, civic rights and responsibilities and all these good things. So I think when we're talking about, a human rights approach to education for all, it's really important to talk about engaging the whole school. So we need to make sure that schools are inclusive, they offer child-centred learning, they are democratic, they're protective, and they promote and implement the child rights approach. And the principles also that are outlined in the Convention on the Rights of the Child. Next slide, please. So I guess the next question that we have to ask ourselves is, how are the rights of children addressed in the development context? And obviously this is a very important issue because the students that are joining us today, I understand are studying as part of an international relations course for summer, and so this is very much part of the whole international relations area. Development is a critical part of that. So one mechanism that we can use to address the rights of the child in the development context is actually the Sustainable Development Goals. And I'm not sure how many people joining us today know about the SDGs, but just to say that they are global development goals, and they were basically designed to focus development efforts in countries and to really help to prioritise policies and programs to help realise the rights of not only children, but also other people in our society. Next slide, please. So this slide is basically, you can see all the different SDGs there. We have 17 Sustainable Development Goals, and you can see that for education is SDG number 4. It's relating to quality education. But I should say that all these goals are actually interlinked. There's lots of linkage, for example, between SDG 4 and 5, where we have this sort of gender equality goals and education. We know that it's very important to make sure that we for education, that we are considering the needs of both boys and girls in them trying to access quality education. So the SDGs are global goals, and they have been adopted by some 150 countries around the world, including Indonesia. These were adopted in 2015 through the United Nations. And we're going to just take a little bit of time to explore what SDG 4 is all about. So if we can have the next slide, we'll just spend a bit of time on this. So SDG 4, well, essentially the outcome that everyone is working globally towards is that by 2030, we want to ensure that all girls and boys complete free, equitable and quality primary and secondary education, leading to relevant and effective learning outcomes. And there are 5 areas that really fall under, or that the SDG 4 goal is comprised. One area is looking at early learning and school readiness. One is focused on primary and secondary school completion. Another is quality and learning outcomes, including skills development. Another is education in emergencies, which obviously is very relevant for the last 18 months that we've been grappling with COVID-19. And then another, the final 5th area is equity and inclusion, which is it is actually very important, and it shouldn't be the least. It really is very important. So the SDG 4 actually comprises 10 indicators in which globally progress is measured against, also at country level. And I think the key words across all of the different targets, these 10 targets for education, are really education completion, education or equity in education, and also learning or learning outcomes. There are several sub-goals, if you like, under SDG 4 that are really directly related to child rights. SDG 4.1 is working to ensure that all girls and boys complete free, equitable and quality primary and secondary education, leading to relevant and effective learning outcomes. And then SDG 4A is focused on building and upgrading education facilities that are child, disability and gender sensitive and provide safe, non-violent, inclusive and effective learning environments for all. And these are big, ambitious goals. There's a lot of work that countries are having to do to really meet these goals. And it seems it's a lot easier to say them than actually realise those goals. So if we can move to the next slide, I want to take a moment to speak a little bit about what Indonesia is actually doing to monitor its progress against SDG, SDG more broadly, but also including SDG 4 for education. The Ministry of Education in Indonesia actually in 2018 developed a comprehensive baseline report for SDG 4, which actually it set the baselines for all of the 10 targets that were going to be measured throughout up until 2030. And the intention is that on an annual basis, there will be like an SDG update report that will be produced. And I think it's important to mention that the 10 indicators that have been adopted by Indonesia under SDG 4 are also in some cases included in big very strategic plans that the country has adopted. So things such as Indonesia's education strategy, the National Development Plan, also include very important SDG indicators for education as well as for other sectors. Next slide, please. And this just gives a little summary of the 10 indicators that we're speaking about that are actually being monitored. And I might just take the first one just as a bit of an example. So the target 4.1 on primary and secondary education, the indicators are really linked to learning outcomes, so trying to track learning outcomes, and that could be in several different areas. In this case, the data source is the PISA assessment, which is Program for International Student Assessment, which looks at student learning in relation to mathematics, science and reading for 15-year-old students. So this is important. Also referenced here is the national assessment, which probably would also look more broadly across different age ranges on learning outcomes. And then the second indicator is really linked to school completion. So the data source for that is called the EMIS, which is also known as the Education Management Information System. And this is something that all ministries of education across the world have EMIS systems to collect core information so we understand what the situation is for children in the education system. So we might just move on. I'm not going to go into too much detail. I think people can take a bit of time a bit later to go through that. So I think if you can click one more time on the slide, it will come up with a little heading. Yep. So I think the important thing to say is that there has been significant progress against the SDG 4 targets, both globally as well as in Indonesia. So, you know, perhaps to start with the positive news is that only around 40% of the indicators, just to say that for access, progress is going quite well. It is projected that the indicators may well be met by 2030, and we can actually have a look at how well Indonesia is doing against the education access targets a little bit later on. We'll do an overview of that. Similarly, over 50% of the indicators measuring skills are also on track, so that's very promising. And again, we think that the targets will be met by 2030. However, for ECD, even though progress is being made, the issue is that it's very, very difficult to reach children in very remote areas with early childhood education and development services. So this is something where UNICEF is actually doing some work in this area with the government to try and extend the reach of early childhood education and development services. Next slide, please. So perhaps just to wrap up a little bit on SDGs. So SDGs are important because they focus policymakers' efforts in addressing the gaps in education, whether those gaps be in relation to access to education, quality, or the relevance of education. So especially as Indonesia has to monitor achievement of the SDGs, it helps policymakers understand what the gaps are and how they can work towards filling those and addressing those gaps. And in doing so, it's hoped that that children will be able to access their rights to quality and inclusive education. So I should say that in moving to the next section, which we're just going to do a little overview of data, of key education data in Indonesia. But I need to say that this data actually was collected before COVID-19. So you can see there's a reference for SUSNAS 2018. And so it is quite possible that the education situation now is worsened because of COVID-19. So I think for this first one, there is a little graphic, there's a little movement there. This is about school completion for primary education. And so basically what we're seeing is that there's around about 96% of children who complete primary school. And this is actually very good. I mean, Indonesia has done some very good work in this area. They are working to achieve 100% of children completing primary education, but it is a work in progress, and this is something that we have to closely monitor. Next slide, please. So the next slide is, you can see the children get taken away. It's a graphic representation of the fact that 85% of children complete junior secondary school. And this means that about a quarter of Indonesian children do not finish junior secondary school. And in fact, still many children who complete primary school don't necessarily go on to start junior secondary school. So there is a problem with transition from primary to junior secondary school. And often this is linked to economic reasons as well, where the affordability of education is a real problem for some students. If we can move to the next slide, then we'll just quickly look at the senior secondary education. So what we can see here is that there's a progressive decline in the number of students that are able to complete, well, actually through all the education levels. So by the time we get to senior secondary, only about 62% of children are able to complete this education level, which basically means that more than half of Indonesian children actually finish senior secondary, which is good, but also there's obviously thank you for the time reminder. Thank you very much. So there's obviously still a big gap here. And I think for this age group, it's not only economic factors that cause them to not be able to be in a position to complete school. It's also factors like early marriage or pregnancy that come into play as well at this age level. So we do have quite a way to go in terms of senior secondary completion, and obviously in also achieving the Indonesian government's goal of 12 years of universal education, which means basically that children complete primary education through to senior secondary education. So if we move to the next slide, this actually gives a bit of a trends analysis. And I think this is quite useful because it's taken over an 18-year period, and it looks at primary the trends in primary completion, which is, you can see the red line. Then it looks at junior secondary completion, which is the blue line, and then you have senior secondary completion, which is the green line. For primary, you can see that the completion rates have actually been fairly stable over the last couple of years. So 2017, 2018. Again, this is older data, and we haven't yet got the up-to-date data. I think it'll be interesting to see the impact of COVID-19 on these figures. For junior secondary, again, similar to primary, you can see that the trends are fairly stable. It's at 85% for several years. Interestingly, for the senior secondary, you can actually see that there's been an increase, in fact, a 4% increase in a 12-month period for senior secondary completion, which is very promising. But again, we will have to analyse the data when there's new sets available. And then I want to go to the next slide just to speak a little bit about gender. Looking at these set of slides just focus on the junior secondary completion. And we can see if you press again on the slide, you can actually see between boys and girls how many actually complete junior secondary. And you can see that in fact, there are less boys than girls that complete junior secondary. And what's interesting about this is that, in fact, in the region, in the Southeast Asian region, there is an increasing trend of boys actually falling behind in completing school at all levels, in fact, at primary, junior secondary, and also senior secondary. So Indonesia is very similar to the situation in other countries. And there's a variety of reasons for that. Some of them are economic, some of them are social, but it is of great concern to people working in education that boys do tend to seem like they are falling behind quite significantly. If we can go to the next slide, then we can then also look at the issue of location. And if you press again, we can see that there's quite, there's a 9% difference between children that are able to complete junior secondary school in rural areas versus children that are able to complete junior secondary in urban areas. So there is a sort of locational dimension to school completion. The next slide, we actually look at the sort of wealth quintiles, if you like. So here we can actually see that there's a 19% difference between completion rates of children that are part of the richest sort of quintile, if you like, and the poorest quintile. And again, important to sort of see that this also plays out in a geographic sense as well, where, in fact, the eastern parts of Indonesia, are quite struggling to really meet some of these education benchmarks. If we go to the next slide, then that actually leads into this issue of regional disparities in accessing or education. And in this case, we're talking about completion. So for Jakarta, we actually have a very, very promising 93% of children completing junior secondary. It's a very, very good and strong figure. But then in Papua, we see there that only 57% of students complete junior secondary, which is about it's a 36% difference between the two geographic locations. And this is probably one of the largest divides that we'll see in Indonesia. There may well be other places outside of Jakarta that also have quite significant gaps when it comes to completion as well. Let's move on for disability status. I think this is an important one in terms of the issue of a right to education and ensure also that education is inclusive. The situation for children with disabilities is very, very dire. It's very serious. You can see there's basically a 48% difference between children completing junior secondary schools who do not have a disability compared to children that that complete junior secondary with a disability. And these are some of the issues that UNICEF is trying to address. with government partners as well as with civil society. I just want to take a moment, grade literacy, which we will talk about it in a little bit more detail later in the presentation. If you just press the button again, you'll see that again, when we look at the national rate for the percentage of children that are literate, we have it at 74%, which is good, but it's not great. It still needs to be worked on. But in a place like Papua, if you press again, you'll see that, in fact, that figure goes down to only 13%. So there is a 61% difference between this sort of national literacy rates and places like Papua. So again, very serious gaps that UNICEF and other partners, government partners as well as non-government partners are working to address. If we can move to the next slide, which just gives a very succinct presentation on skills development trends. So in this, this is the percentage of youth not in education, in education, employment, or any other forms of training. This is actually reasonably promising in the sense that the trend you can see is going down, which is good. We want the green line to go down, but it's still relatively high. So again, this is something that we would need to come back to really see the impact of COVID-19 on these results. And then if we move on to higher education, which I'm sure will be of interest to many people joining us today, actually the data is reasonably concerning. It's only about 30% of, this is about enrolment, this figure. So 30% are enrolled of children or young people are enrolled in tertiary education. Again, this is an area, developing higher education is, an area that we really need to focus on. Lots of partners are sort of involved in this. It's particularly important to invest in this area to optimize human resources and development within the country. Next slide. We're just going to speak a little bit about out of school children, because I think this really demands some attention. There are in Indonesia around about 4.2, some figures talk about 4.3 out of school children, and these figures are actually from 2018. We, through UNICEF monitoring and also with working through government across the country, have undertaken several rounds of monitoring to try and identify out of school children and to see what their situation is in relation to COVID-19 pandemic. And I think it's fair to say from the monitoring that the numbers of out of school children are increasing. The numbers of children that are also at risk of dropping out of school are also increasing. What's interesting with these figures is that you can see that most of the out of school children, 72%, are actually dropping out of senior secondary school, only 23% for junior secondary, and a small 5% for primary school. And yeah, so I think this is important data for us to have. So while we focused on data relating to formal education, this is really about children outside of the formal education system. So if we can go to the next slide, we're going to just take a moment to have a look at the way that COVID-19 has affected children realising their right to education. And if we can just move to a slide, I know I'm probably running out of a bit of time, but I just wanted to talk a little bit about the global impact. So we know that globally there have been widespread school closures and major disruption to the education system, which also means there's been major disruption to learning. There's been difficulties with training teachers and other education personnel that are critical for delivering quality education. And I think it's fair to say that COVID-19 has also exacerbated learning inequalities as well. We've spoken about the increased numbers of students that are dropping out of school, and in this slide we can see that 24 million learners are at risk of not returning to school, which is this is globally, so really significant. And also important to note is just the annual funding gaps as well for education. So it's estimated that these gaps may be up to 200 billion per year. So obviously we need funding to make sure that education services are reaching the people that they need to reach in the right way. So let's, and maybe just to also quote that in April 2020 alone, 94% of learners worldwide were affected by the pandemic, which represented 1.58 billion children, all the way from pre-primary education levels to higher education levels across 200 countries. So really the scale is very, very significant. If we can move to the next slide, I'm just going to talk a little bit about what the impact has been in our region in Southeast Asia. And if we move to the next slide, I just want to just quickly talk about the situation before the pandemic began. So before the pandemic, we had 35 million children that were not in school. We had one of 5 children below the age of 10 that were unable to read, and we also had significant inequities relating to access to education and learning, particularly children that are part of sort of ethnic minority groups as well as children with disabilities. But when we look now in the situation we have with the pandemic, so if you can move to the next slide, we can see these numbers actually increasing quite significantly. So we see that there's a 35 to, jump to 40 million, 5 million jump of children not in school. We can see that instead of 1 in 5, there are now one of 3 children below the age of 10 that are unable to read. And then you can see that more than 50 million children in the region are experiencing inequitable access to education and learning. And much of this is linked to the fact that over the last 18 months, there's been a very heavy reliance on distance learning just because of school closures. And then we can see a kind of worrying projection there that, well, the estimate is that there's been 1 trillion in losses in lifetime earnings. So it's very significant indeed. If we can move to the next slide, I won't spend too much time on this. I think this is something that people can, the other one actually, learning loss, if you could go back. Yeah. So this one, I think, again, it just summarizes some of these big figures that we've been talking about in terms of the global impact of COVID-19. It does go beyond school closures. It's important to think about the loss in learning. It's important to think about the situation, particularly I think that the child labour statistic there is really worrying as well, which is obviously also linked to children deciding to drop out of school as well. So yeah, some really significant push and pull factors there when it comes to the learning loss situation and other dimensions. So if we could go to the next slide, I'd like to just take a moment to reflect on what the impact of COVID-19 has been in Indonesia. And I should say that we only have fairly preliminary data on the impact. If we can go to the next slide, this slide actually talks about literacy and numeracy or foundational skills and the impact that COVID-19 is having on learning loss, particularly for grades 1 and 2. And I think the thing to focus on here is that, you can see here that the projection is that for literacy, there would be, 6 months of learning loss due to school closures, and for numeracy, probably 5 months of learning loss. We're also the World Bank, this is based on World Bank analysis, so they also predict a decline in Indonesian student learning of between 0.9 and 1.2% of learning years, which is very significant. So, I think the point is that this is an early indication of the kind of learning loss that we're facing. But quite honestly, I don't think we'll really know the full impact for several years to come. If we can go to the next slide. This is just giving some projections around the program for international student assessment known as PISA. In this one, it talks about sort of an optimistic or best case scenario where you have PISA scores declining by 5 points from where they are now at 360 points. And then we have also a worst case scenario, which would represent a 10-point decline, which is very significant because this is actually linked to reading scores. So, you know, declines of this magnitude will have a very significant impact on the lives of children. If we can move to the next slide, I just want to give a bit of an overview. I think this is useful to wrap up a little bit of what we've spoken about in terms of the impact of COVID-19. So for the last 18 months, we've had more than 600 schools have been closed. This has affected more than 68 million students, also affected teaching staff as well, around 4 million teachers and other education personnel. We've talked about the fact that around 4.3 million children are actually out of school and that this number is increasing. Also, parents are really important stakeholders to sort of consider in all this because they have found it very difficult to support children to learn remotely during the pandemic, and there's a number of reasons for that. Also, teachers have found it very difficult, particularly in linking in with online learning platforms and supporting remote learning. We know that children with disabilities are often the worst affected, and they have found it very difficult to access digital learning or remote learning opportunities. And maybe just to reflect that the top 2 challenges that students have identified as being really of concern to them is the lack of teacher guidance when it comes to distance learning and optimizing that, as well as the lack of access to internet. If we can move to the next slide, I'll try to be brief on this. This data comes out of some recent work that UNICEF has done on doing a situational analysis of digital education in Indonesia. The work actually focused on 3 areas or themes. The first was digital learning content and platforms. Then we have digital skills, and then lastly, connectivity in schools. And I think for the first theme, I think it's important to note that students' uptake on, many of the digital learning platforms was kind of limited because there was a perception that these learning platforms were kind of offering poor quality learning opportunities. There's also been challenges with accessing quite sophisticated platforms. There's a preference for students to use social media platforms because they are actually easier to use and more affordable and require less bandwidth. And also, I think there's been very significant challenges faced by who we call last mile users. So these are students in the most difficult to reach areas to really try and optimize access to distance learning. For digital skills, while there is potential to develop to support children and teachers to develop digital skills, there's a lot of work to do in that space. We also have challenges with low parental support, children to adjust to digital learning because parents don't necessarily understand how to use the internet and online learning platforms. And then, as I mentioned before, teachers are also struggling with that as well in delivering online education. And then for connectivity, which is really, really an important issue for children, particularly in remote areas, they really struggle with accessing the internet. So then the question is, how do they then, access distance learning? And for many, the internet is really, unaffordable and, represents a significant barrier. It's also difficult to access digital devices as well for many children as well. So just moving on, this is sort of the final stretch of the presentation, but I think it's important for us to reflect on what is UNICEF doing to try and address these big challenges that we've spoken about. And for COVID-19 specifically, but also it has applicability throughout our programming. If we can change the slide, that would be good. I want to just speak a little bit about the work that we're doing. We are trying to engage with development partners. If we can change the slide, please, that would be great. Thank you. So we are engaging with development partners to support education and learning recovery and resilience building. We have a number of programs that are multi-sectoral that are supporting safe school reopening, which means that, they're providing things like water and sanitation, health advice, child protection, and also education support. These are often, most of our programs are focused on very geographically disadvantaged areas. We're also supporting teachers to gain skills, teachers and students to gain skills in how to engage with digital learning, as well as in a mixture of digital and face-to-face modalities. We're helping at the moment with developing remedial materials as well, remedial learning materials, so that teachers can help their students to catch up on their learning that they have lost over the last 18 months. We're also engaging with young people to try and create a sort of safe space for children or young people to help us create solutions, particularly in digital education, because often young people know what they want to see in learning platforms. We are also working a lot to try and reach out-of-school children and to deliver services for them so that they can actually have a second opportunity to complete their education. And for on an ongoing basis, we are working with key ministry government partners to develop a nationwide back-to-school campaign. And then importantly, we are working with ministries of health and with Ministry of Education on monitoring the teacher vaccination and school reopening. And I wanted to share a little bit of an update on this. So for teacher vaccinations, we have about 63% of teachers that have, as of the 4th of October, received their first dose of COVID-19 vaccination, and 40% have received their second dose. And for schools that are reopening, this is a fairly slow process, but there's around 42% of schools that have reopened for limited face-to-face learning. That's as of the 29th of September. So things are changing. If we can go to the next slide, I just want to spend a little bit of time on drilling down a little bit on what UNICEF is actually doing from a programmatic perspective. So we do have a very strong focus on these sort of 4 areas that you can see up on the screen. Firstly, on early childhood development, we are promoting a holistic and integrated approach to early childhood development. For equitable access, we are really trying to support out-of-school children to help them access non-formal education opportunities. We're also working on promoting inclusive education as well as education in emergencies. For promoting learning outcomes, we have a very strong focus on early grade literacy, and I'll speak about that a little bit later. And then also for adolescent development, we're really trying to support skills development, particularly 21st century skills development, which is so relevant to employers today, to us all today. So these are very important investments. Next slide, please. So this is a bit of a crazy diagram, but this is our theory of change for our program. And what I wanted to pull out of this is just to say that we really have a focus on 5 areas. And we have programs that are working with out-of-school children. We have programs working on early childhood education and development. We are working to promote foundational skills, which are numeracy and literacy in early grades. We're also working to promote 21st century skills amongst young people, as well as the 5th area you can see there is education in emergencies, which obviously is very relevant to the situation we find ourselves at the moment with COVID. If we can go to the next slide, I just want to speak a little bit about our geographical focus. So, okay, so fine, I'll wrap up very soon. I've just got a couple more slides coming. So our geographical focus, we have a very strong focus in Papua, which I'll speak about, but we also, so there's a strong focus in Eastern Indonesia, but we're also working a little bit in Java, and as you can see there, that's a sort of summary of the key programs that we are delivering in those areas. So you can have a look at that a bit later. And then finally, if we can move ahead, because I'm sort of running out of time, I just want to talk quickly about the work that we are doing to promote and improve early grade literacy in Papua. Please move the slide. So just as a little bit of background, if you can change the slide. So we have only 6% of early grade students in Papua province acquire reading skills. The ultimate goal for UNICEF to support is to improve student reading and comprehension skills. And the way that we do this is we focus on trying to build the capacity of teachers through regular training and mentoring. We also have developed a wide range of teaching and learning materials to support literacy and numeracy. We're also working with communities, whether it be local governments or parents, to try and make sure that we can mobilise resources as well as support for early grade literacy work. If we can go to the next slide, I'm going to shorten this part of the presentation because I'm running out of time. But I just wanted to show a little bit about the kinds of things that we're doing to support the improvement of literacy in Papua. And it is a holistic approach. So you can see in the top left corner, there's a photo there of some teacher training going on with particular focus on working with teacher working groups. We have technical assistance that will support districts and schools to improve their education service delivery in relation to literacy. We also promote the use of student assessments as well, so teachers are able to understand the level of learning attainment that their students have, and so therefore can address particular gaps in their literacy skills. We've developed a range of materials, as I said, and we've provided those to very many schools and children. We're also promoting reading as a culture in schools. So setting up reading corners and libraries within schools is really important. And the last two are really focusing on policy advocacy. So really working with local districts to prioritise their resources for early grade literacy, as well as engaging with the community. And then lastly, if we can change the slide, I just want to speak very quickly about the results from this investment that we are making in early grade literacy in Papua. So as you can see there, there's some interesting figures. It's important to say that basically there have been very significant gains. In the schools we're working, you can see the lower performing schools, there's been a 36% increase in the level of, increase in the ability for children to be able to read appropriately. And I think this is a really, it just goes to show when you have targeted support, you can actually make very significant gains. We have worked with over nearly 30,000 students in grade 2 and 3 across Papua, and really trying to work with them very carefully in both teaching and learning. So that's for teachers and students. Then you can see there some figures around teachers and principals, and really trying to make sure that they're able to tailor their instruction to meet the needs of their students. And also to mention the materials, the learning materials that we've developed are very contextualised for the Papua context, which is really important. So I think that's where I'll stop. The next slide, there are some reading resources that we were suggesting, so that might be something that interesting there for people. But then I'd like to maybe just invite Arita to facilitate the Q&A session. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for Ms.Katheryn. Now we will move on to the Q&A session. But before that, for all the participants, we would like to give a little conclusions from today's presentation. So here from the presentation of Ms.Katheryn, it is said that child as an actor is a part of a nation, and it's very important, but it is not owned by anything or anyone. This presentation uses a causality analysis of issues regarding the variable of parents, governments, priority, and fund allocations in the terms of issues regarding quality of educations for children. And then UNICEF is working with several institutions from the scale of global and domestic for making sure for children to have the right of protections wherever they are, including education institutions. And this program is created and formulated in order to make sure for children to have the right of protections wherever they are, including education institutions. It is to make sure they got the right of an adequate inclusive, and equal quality of education by developing an environment that supports the learning process for children. Basically, it is based from SDGs point 4. Its sub points that it is in a goal to be achieved in 2030. And then Indonesia itself still have many issues of struggle in order to achieve a universal and comprehensive high quality of education, such as the gaps between provinces of children assurance of education rights. And later on, she explained the impact of COVID-19, the global impact of COVID-19 towards the education's effort for the governments and of course for the UNICEF itself. Because COVID-19 has made a major disruptions to education system, a big difficulty on delivering educational matters to children, and school closures also bring out many issues for the children itself. COVID-19 has brought a great impact. I'm very sorry about that. A great impact for children and education professionals around the world, not to mention parents as one of the stakeholders on educational system. And because of this matter, a learning crisis has happened, but on the development and digital education has been formulated by UNICEF and stakeholders around educational system, which focuses on the content and platforms and digital skills, and of course, connectivity, especially in rural or remote areas. In this matter, UNICEF has formulated several programs, has built an engagement with several partners, and give supports, technical assistance, and trainings for professionals in this sector which is education, and build a suitable learning content for the including like the developing early grade literacy with holistic approach for all children around Indonesia. Maybe that's all for the conclusion from me. We will go to the Q&A session. For the participants, you can give your remarks and questions through the chat box, and you can also raise your hands, and please prepare to give your remarks or share your questions with us. So I will call you one by one. But before that, Ms.Katheryn, may I ask you, would you prefer to give the answers from the questions one per one, or would you like break it out into sessions, maybe in one session, including 3 questions?
I think so. Yeah, I think it's probably more efficient to take a few questions and then answer them. Yeah, rather than one by one. Yeah. Thank you for checking that, Areta. That's great. Yep.
Okay. Noted very well. Maybe we will start from the first person, which is Miss Anissa Antania Hanjani. Please, we welcome you to share your questions or remarks. Thank you.
Thank you, Katheryn. What a wonderful session today to learn how children's rights is very important for us in Indonesia. My question is, I have 2 questions for you, and the first one is about the community engagement. As far as I know, since I ever got a training from WHO, there are some steps to do community engagement, especially when we were trained as an officer from United Nations. And my question is, I want to know what the findings from your observation as to engage the community, especially about child marriage during the increase of child marriage during COVID pandemic. Because as far as I know, in Indonesia, the child marriage issue is becomes more and more concerning since during pandemic, the children cannot do anything. They feel bored, especially for the secondary school student, and then they just thought, okay, I will marry someone because I'm bored, like that. And then my second question is about your work in Papua. As far as I know too, Papua isn't only challenging in terms of facility and infrastructure, but also the conflict. How do you face the challenge, and what are the things that you do face them. Thank you.
Great. Well, look, thanks, Anissa, for the very good questions. On the issue of child marriage, I have to say, because I'm not a child protection specialist, I probably don't have a lot of hard data or anything to share with you, but that's something that it's a question I can take on notice, and I can certainly provide some further details perhaps through Areta, and we can share with the broader student group. But I will just say something on it, and it's probably not from a particularly informed view because I'm, as I said, I'm not working in child protection in Indonesia, but I do think that, the issue of child marriage is something that we need to engage all community stakeholders on. It's not just about parents. It's got to be, leaders within the community. It's got to be, government authorities. It's got to be, in schools. You've got to take a holistic approach. You can't just, pick one particular, stakeholder and say, all right, we'll just focus on that particular group. So I think that it's making sure that young people feel that they have the space to make informed choices, about their future, essentially. And the only way we can really do that is to try to educate them as well as the people around them to be clear that there are choices. It doesn't mean that you do necessarily have only one choice, and that is to enter into, an early marriage. The other dynamic, of course, is the fact that often marriages, I'm speaking more broadly in Southeast Asia because I've worked for a long time in Southeast Asia, but more generally. But, in times of economic crisis, often the issue of child marriage becomes even more serious because, households want to either, send their daughters away because there's dowries and these sorts of issues that come into play. So I think, again, there's a lot of factors that play into the issue of child marriage. There's also cultural factors as well that is something that even though you might do lots and lots of advocacy, it's also about behaviour change and changing perceptions, and that doesn't take 5 minutes. That takes a really long time. So thanks for that question. And then when it comes to the situation, you talked about the conflict situation, and I'm really glad you raised this because that's what I often say to my team. We write these proposals to say, look, we need resources, to do more in early grade learning or early grade literacy in Papua. But then I often say, but what about talking about how we're doing that? Because it's actually really challenging. As you say, there are difficulties in the operating context in Papua. And I think the way that we try to manage those difficulties is it really comes down to relationships. It comes down to spending time and effort in building good, solid relationships with lots of different people. Government is very important. Local government, very, very important. I understand also in Papua, there's also a sort of clan structure as well. So that's also very important to understand who our local communities, who are the decision makers, what they want to actually achieve, so it's not just UNICEF coming in saying, hey, we'll give you all this money and you can go around and help people. It's actually saying, do you want to do this? And if you want to do it, we can be with you to support you to do that. So it's got to be a partnership approach. It can't be, UNICEF coming in and saying, here you go, here's some money, go and do EGL. It doesn't work. And so, yeah, I think that was probably how I'd answer the conflict situation. It is difficult and we have to keep a constant sort of monitoring of the situation, but we do have very good connections with people as well. And there's some very good people doing some great things in education in Papua. So thanks for the questions, Anissa.
Thanks a lot for the answer.
Thank you very much. Maybe Ms.Katheryn, we will move on to another person, which is
please
Mr. Marcel. For Mr. Marcel, please do give us your remarks or questions.
Okay, thank you for the chance. I would like to ask some questions that based on the children's rights. That previously I've joined for the CRC convention in Central Java of Indonesia. That was in 2019. And I realized that we have a lot of tasks for the Children Forum or Children Forum or Indonesia State Forum Anak. This is the national community that for focusing to maintain the problem for the children's rights, and we're rising for the children's rights also. So at this point, we have to see that in 2020 until 2021 right now, we have a lot of engagement. I mean, like the increasingly numbers, like previously Anissa said that about the marriage number, the early marriage age numbers, that's increasingly. But with our mandatory and our task that we have to decrease it. But by the time and based on the COVID-19 pandemic, that's affected to the increasing the numbers. So another things because in Indonesia has a really different situation for the online learning or the because there's a lot of area that's got in remote area. So it's make us a very challenging to maintain the children to get their rights. So because at sometimes they are living in highline, and no signal to get for the learning section. So the challenging for the teacher is also going to home by home and teach one by one. That's a really ridiculous, like that's not will happen in every time. That will take a lot of time. So they cut for illegally to open the schools, but it's not going to the really schools. They make another schools in their area to keep the learning going well, because the teacher says this will be a gap generation, which is like like example, in the previous they are in 8th grades and going to in 11th grade. So which means in junior high school to going to the senior high school. So it will be like the emotional is stuck in 2 years before. So do you have any suggestion to make another activities or event that will create and to decrease the gap it is? Because at the gap years, I mean, the mentality of the children, it will take a lot of mention like that. I think that's it. Is it clear?
Well, I'll try my best, Marcel, to answer. And if I'm not sure. I think I think that there's some really good reflections there that you've offered. So I think the thing about sort of, I guess, the gaps you were talking about in terms of emotional gaps or educational gaps, particularly at higher grades.
Okay.
I think what we have to say is, I would say that it's really important to try and invest as much as possible in giving children the best start in their education. And often if you do that, it actually means that they start their education at the right age for grade, and that they're actually given the time to emotionally develop, at their pace throughout their education life. Whereas if you have a situation as many children face in Indonesia, but also in the region, where children maybe can't access early childhood education, so then they start primary school at maybe not the right age, they're constantly then catching up throughout their education pathway. So when they get to higher levels of education, they're still struggling. And I think that, so my answer, I think, to that, and I'm not sure if this is really helpful, but I think really strong investment in getting children in school from an early age is critical, because it sets themselves up for life, in terms of their educational achievement, but also their own personal development as well. I think what's also important when we're talking about young people, and not that I'm an expert because I'm an old person now, but what I would say also is that we are all trying to support the 21st century skills agenda, so that, you know, the big thing that education systems in Southeast Asia struggle with, and, you know, across the world, but in Southeast Asia as well, is the fact that the education systems are sort of behind the times. Often they are not focusing on helping students to critically think, to work in teams, to be reflective, to be analytical, you know, to be adept at, you know, using ICT and other things. So, and we know that these are really core skills that people actually need throughout their lives, and that all employers look for people that can work in teams, that are analytical, that are problem solving, all these good things. So this is something that we need to continue to invest in. And for education, for UNICEF, because Indonesia is such a huge country, we can't reach, you know, we have to work through partners to try and reach scale, you know. And so that is why digital education is really, really important. Digital education is here to stay. You know, it's not going anywhere. It's here to stay. As you said, the problem is that we have many children that are in remote areas that can't access digital education. So then we have to think about how can we be creative to reach those, and what I said before in the presentation was last mile users, you know, these kids that really are left behind. Now, I know that there have been attempts in the last 18 months for remote learning, to provide, you know, learning opportunities through TV, through radio, paper-based materials, these kinds of things. All ministries are working on that in the region. They're all working on trying to think up different inclusive education, you know, services for remote learning for kids that are really, you know, vulnerable and remote. So yeah, so the work is ongoing, but I think the big thing that's holding things back at the moment is the connectivity issue, that we're not actually, kids in remote areas are really struggling to actually access the internet. It's incredibly difficult. So, you know, therefore we have to go with an approach of a mixed approach. We've got to promote face-to-face learning. That's really important. And that's why it's very, very important for schools to be reopening at this time in a safe way. You know, but at the same time, we can't ignore digital learning. We've got to be able to support both. It has to be a blended kind of approach. So I don't know. I did my best to answer your question. I'm sorry if I couldn't answer everything, but thank you for the question, Marcel. And well, yes, we'll look forward to how things unfold in all those important areas. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Because it's really complicated, right? So
it's very complicated. It's very complicated. I agree.
Yeah.
Thank you very much for the answer and the questions. We will move on to another person, which is Yutatri. Please, you may share us your question or remarks.
Okay, thank you so much, Ms. Bennett. Such a nice presentation before. I'd like to ask you about this current situation that, especially during this pandemic, there is a lot of, several children or teacher or staff that refuse to be vaccinated. And in Indonesia, especially, the term for offline school is you have to be vaccinated full, which is 2 doses. In your opinion and in UNICEF opinion, how can we make a fair education for them, for those who refuse to get vaccinated? Thank you.
Well, I mean, this is a very good question, and it's really a bit tricky, actually. UNICEF's perspective is that, you know, schools, you know, vaccination, firstly, schools should try to reopen, you know, number one, because schools need to reopen because we need to provide face-to-face learning for students. As you are one of many millions of students, Utah. So, you know, all of you guys have really suffered over the last 18 months. And I think, you know, if schools can reopen in a safe way, which they can, then, you know, it's very important that they do that as soon as possible. And that's why I mentioned the data on school reopening. It is a little bit slow going at the moment. When schools reopen, it's really important that COVID-19 protocols are applied And so that means things like mask wearing, proper hand washing, social distancing, all these kinds of things. And schools all over the world are actually doing that. It's not just in Indonesia, it's all over the world. Schools are actually opening, and they're doing it safely. The thing that with school reopening is that a really important element of it is that teachers, it's really important for teachers to get vaccinated. And the ministry and the government, Ministry of Education and the government more generally in Indonesia has really prioritised and is prioritising the vaccination of teachers. And it really, I think it's making good progress. It's a little bit slower, but they are hoping, I think it's probably by either November or December that all teachers would be fully vaccinated. So I think that's a very important investment to make in safe school reopening. Obviously, whether people get vaccinated or not, you can't force people, right? So it's a personal choice. I think any country in the world, there are some countries that are kind of also saying if you have a particular job, you actually need to get vaccinated or you can't do that job. And I'm not sure I don't know what the position of the Indonesian government is on that, generally kind of thing. But certainly, I understand that there is very significant promotion of teachers getting vaccinated. And one of the interesting things, we did a little survey amongst teachers, I think it was around 4,000 teachers and recently, and it was found that a really high percentage of those teachers, and they tended to be, I think they were mostly teachers in the public sector, but a lot of those teachers were really keen to get vaccinated. So actually, the impression we have is that, in fact, a lot of teachers, the majority of teachers, will want to get vaccinated. It's understandable that there is some vaccine hesitancy, whether it be amongst teachers or just the general public. That always happens. But I think as things progress, people will become more confident. So hopefully I've answered your question.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you once again for Mr. Yutatri. Maybe we should move on to another one, which is Ms. Cantika Khairunisa. Please, you may proceed with your questions or not. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you so much for the opportunity, and it was indeed a very insightful lecture. I apologize in advance because I can turn on my camera due to network issues. And actually, my question is kind of out of topic to the lecture, but it's still related to the child rights. So do you mind if I deliver my question, Ms. Bennett?
Please go ahead.
Okay, thank you so much for the permission. As we know, there are many cultures in this world that are unique to each country and civilization. And one of them is called Bakaposh. Basically, it's a culture where Afghan girls are forced to dress up and act like boys if the parents doesn't or can have a son. And from the description alone, we can see that it violates child rights. Yet, it is also a part of a culture which can be changed easily. So what do you think the UNICEF can do in order to change this culture that violates child rights while not offending the families that has done that culture for presumably many, many generations? I think that's my question. Thank you.
Oh, thanks so much. I had not heard of that. That's incredible. Interestingly, I do know that on one of the Pacific Islands, there is a culture of if a family doesn't have a boy, they actually ask, if they don't have a girl, they actually ask sometimes the boy to live as a girl. So it's kind of interesting. It's kind of the opposite. Look, I don't know the specific circumstances in Afghanistan. I've never worked on Afghanistan, but one thing I will say about, I want to maybe just respond in terms of how do we kind of change issues around gender, because I think that's what this is about, actually. It's very, very difficult to change behaviour, particularly behaviour that, like you were saying, this tradition has gone on for probably centuries and millennia, whatever, So number one, in order to change, to make change, it's on gender issues. It's really important, whether you're talking about change relating to girls or whether you're talking about change relating to boys. It's really important to make sure that if you are going to try and change practices, that actually there is widespread engagement. So it can't just be with men. It can't just be with women. It's actually got to be with everyone. Because part of the change is actually creating space for change, and that requires a power shift. It requires the people that are the decision makers. So perhaps in patriarchal societies, we have, men that are often the decision makers. It requires them to actually give back some power and space to allow women to actually claim a space. So these are really complex issues. And what I would just simply say, and it's probably very inadequate, but what I would say is that if there was going to be an attempt to try and promote change with that particular practice, you would need to engage everyone in that community. It would need to be leaders, whether it's religious leaders, political leaders, community leaders. There would need to be a sort of really broad, widespread engagement. But we also would need to make sure that it's engaging with men and women. It's not just men, it's not just women, it's everyone. So I don't know if that has helped, but hopefully that gives some food for thought. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you so much for your answer.
No worries.
Then we will move on to maybe another section. Another questionnaire which comes from the chat box. It is from Ms. Shamira Alaidirus. She would like to ask about the 12 years of Universal Learning Program in Indonesia and with its help for assisting towards students who got affected by the COVID-19. Does this policy of learning program give any impact on reducing education inequality gaps during the pandemic? She would like to ask about that from the UNICEF perspective, Ms. Katheryn.
Oh, thank you for the question. I think with these policies, whether it's the universal what did I say? It was 12 years, wasn't it? And then we also have a concept around basic education as well, which, that differs between countries. I think what's important to say is that it's always important to set benchmarks. So, you've got to have a goal and it's got to be clear and it's got to be something that is realistic and attainable. And so I think it's really excellent that Indonesia has some very clear goals when it comes to, education attainment and where they want to see things, in a fixed sort of period of time. Obviously, there were issues before COVID. So, there obviously, like in the data that I presented, we could see some clear gaps, right, in education and attainment, most definitely. The situation we have at the moment is that I think that the data, we don't have an updated really updated data. I think a lot of this data on the impact of COVID-19 is, it's not necessarily looking at sort of key indicators like completion and that kind of thing because of the fact that schools haven't been open. So for very practical reasons, it's incredibly difficult to collect a lot of the core education data because of the fact that schools just have been closed. But we do have an indication through looking at some pieces of analysis that's been done to kind of get a sense that definitely learning has been lost and there needs to be very significant efforts on the part of pretty much everyone in the world and in Indonesia to support children to catch up on their learning. It's very important. So I think that, while those goals are it's really excellent to have those in place, they have to be in place. But when you're dealing with a really extreme situation like COVID, which I can say the disruption that COVID has caused to the education system around the world, as well as in Indonesia, is absolutely unprecedented. It's unprecedented in any of our lifetimes. It's unprecedented probably in the last 100 years, since the pandemic before, even when you throw in world wars and these sorts of things, right? So it's really big. And so, that's really hard to manage. And so even though you might have the best intentions to have really fantastic goals, we want to work towards 12 years, all these sorts of things, you have to have them. But now we have to manage the impact of COVID. And that that is going to set things back, and we have to be realistic about what we can achieve, within the time frame that we set ourselves. So like I said before, while there's been good progress made against SDG targets and also against the Indonesian, targets around universal as well as basic education, we don't know how things are, there is going to be a setback. No doubt about it. There will be a significant setback. Over. Thanks for the question, by the way.
Thank you for the answers also, Ms. Katheryn. We'll move on to another one, which is Ms. Shalina Leana. I hope I am saying your names right. She would like to ask regarding the education investment. Based on your opinion, what kind of investment best to suit education development? She would like to ask about it. I think maybe about education aid, if I'm not mistaken. Education aid, education investment.
Yes. Okay. Okay. Well, that's quite a tricky question to answer because it's such a big area. One of the things that Indonesia and other countries do is that they will prepare kind of a roadmap of what are the priorities for education in their countries, right? So often it's a strategy. They'll take a 5-year strategy and they'll say, right, these are the key priorities. They might be things like developing teachers. It might be things like developing curriculum. It could be infrastructure investments around building, bigger and better schools. It could be things like linked to the quality of education, like school inspection, for example, where we have inspectors that go out and sort of check that the education is being delivered in a sort of minimum quality way. There's a range of different things. Also things like even just school financing, for example. So in Indonesia, what's really excellent is that you guys have, for many years now, you have a operating grant system that all schools in Indonesia get a basic budget to basically operate. And in some countries that doesn't happen. So it's great that Indonesia has these sorts of systems in place. So what I'm getting at is that it really does depend on the country's circumstance. What is the most important reform or priority that a country wants to work on? And that will change. I mean, we can set the most beautiful 5-year strategy, but then when a pandemic happens, we have to really rethink, because of just the huge impact that the pandemic has had, right? So what I would be saying now for Indonesia is that, really trying to help children catch up on their learning is absolutely critical. We need to help teachers be able to conduct remedial education, and this is going to be something that's going to be critical importance over the next several years, many years to come, I think will be very, very important. So it's a really hard question to answer. I mean, one thing I will say is that when the first time I worked in Indonesia, which was 2008 to 2011, the government at that point had adopted a constitutional guarantee of 20% of national financing towards the education sector. And I think that was very brave of Indonesia to do that, to actually make that a constitutional guarantee. That doesn't happen in all countries, and globally 20% of the national budget is basically a benchmark. It's what countries actually have to get to in order to then start to be able to say that they have semi-adequate financing for education. It's really the benchmark. So it is good that Indonesia has taken that step, and I think is continuing to kind of work on that. But quite honestly, it's the priorities for the investment priorities for education will change. And while we have to take a long-term view of building education systems, we also have to be prepared to respond to disasters when they happen. And COVID-19 is such a disaster. Over.
Thank you very much for the answer. I'm very sorry about the loud noise in the back, which is azan, because it's
That's
about
okay. It's Friday prayers, is it? Friday prayers?
Yes.
I thought I could hear that. Yeah, it's nice.
I'm very sorry about it.
No, don't apologize. It's fine.
We will move on maybe to the next question. In the chat box, there is still quite some questions. Maybe first one, it's quite a long questions, but maybe I could read it. It is from Mr. Pratama Indra Hermawan. He would like to ask to Ms. Katheryn, firstly, he would like to say he is deeply regret of his inability to turn on his camera. And he would like to ask about the education progress loss, learning loss. Yeah, education progress learning loss. So he first then shared his observation from his sibling, which is still in school. It is almost 2 years since the last face-to-face learning in school. So children begin to get used to not learning something every day. They tend to do something fun and like not focusing into the school activity, like playing games any time of the day. This happens at his environment because he's now going to apply to the senior high school, and currently the school has begun to reopen. But still, I believe to reach a great progress to get rid of the learning loss is still a long way to go. Is there anything from your perspective, of course, Ms. Katheryn, that we can do to hasten the progress of getting rid of the learning loss? Thank you very much.
Okay, well, look, thanks, Mr. Pratama, for the question. I think what's really important is that schools really focus on core curricula. So as I understand, in Indonesia, they have introduced a khusus curriculum or curriculum khusus. And so, you know, this will focus on the core subjects. There'll be other subjects outside of that, but basically, you know, it's paring back to basically the basics of learning. So I can just say that I've come from Cambodia. I just finished my Chief of Education job in Cambodia a couple of months ago, and we were working, the government came out and basically said, look, for secondary school, we just want to focus on basically 5 key subjects. For primary, we're just going to focus on 2. It's just going to be literacy and numeracy, you know. So I think during this time, it's really important that you know, schools really focus, I think, on the emergency curriculum because it is pared back. It's really focused. And then I think the other thing that's going to be very important, like I mentioned before, is to support teachers to be able to provide catch-up learning. And that might mean that they have to simplify, you know, the curriculum or the materials that they're working with to really help to understand what level of learning their students are at. And they might need to use, I mean, you know, when we talk about catch-up learning or remedial education, it is really important for students to use some kind of assessment tool so that they can understand what level their students are at, learning level the student is at, and then they can compare that with what learning level they should be. You know, so then they understand what the gap is when it comes to supporting their students to learn. So I would suggest that, you know, that it's got to be a really strong focus on the core subjects. I mean, I think the other thing is that we all know that distance learning is really problematic. It's very essential. It's been incredibly important for the last 18 months, you know, and it will continue to be. But obviously not all students are able to make the most of it. It's really tricky. And we all know how it feels to work from home, you know, or study from home. It is really difficult. You have to have motivation, you have to have focus, you have to have discipline. And for a lot of parents and home environments, those things don't exist. So it's incredibly challenging. So I think, you know, that's why UNICEF is really speaking quite strongly about and supporting the government also in really speaking a lot about trying to get schools to reopen, because I think it's only when you start to have those opportunities for face-to-face learning that you can start to get back some of that learning. It can be, you know, the discipline, the focus, you know, all those sorts of things are so important. Over. Thanks.
Thank you very much for your answer. Then I conclude that it is necessary to also, I think from your answer, I could conclude also that it is necessary from people from home, from people around the kid itself, the child itself, to help him, her, they to manage their discipline, to manage their activity, to focus
Definitely.
on additional effort for them. I think that's all for the question. Actually, some of the people in the chat box also would like to give their most gratitude for you for being here, for
That's
sharing.
nice. Thank you so much. So I probably have around 10 minutes if there are any further questions. I have to sort of wrap up at 12, Arita, if that's okay. Is that okay with you?
That's very okay with me. Actually, we're about to commence to our the closing segmentation of this
Okay,
event.
fine. Okay, great. No problem.
Could you give us a little closing statement or maybe an encouragement to who wants to go to your path maybe in order to
okay.
Please you give us your statement for the closing.
Oh, wow. Well, look, I mean, I just want to thank everyone for being so engaged, and thank you so much for the really great questions. You've actually really made me think a lot about different things, you know, so I just want to thank everyone for their generosity and, you know, in taking the time to join and to asking these very good questions. I really just want to encourage everyone. I think we have to acknowledge that the last 18 months have been very tough. And I think that we need to acknowledge that. But now things are changing, and I think, you know, we can be a lot more positive. I don't want people to kind of have the impression that it's all doom and gloom, you know. In the presentation, I just tried to look at the data and explain the data and try to get a sense of where the gaps are. But that doesn't mean that really good progress isn't, you know, good progress has been made. And there's a lot of really committed people out there in the education world that really want to see children succeed, and they want to see children catch up on their learning. So I have every faith that, you know, that the Indonesian and, you know, community, education community will be able to support students in the ways that they need. But we also have to be realistic that this is a big job, and, you know, we need resources and we need focus to be able to do the job properly. So I think that's probably all I'll say. Maybe one thing just on the, Arita, you mentioned career type thing. I mean, I just want to say that my background is that I come from a very small island called Tasmania in Australia. It's very isolated. It's one of the poorest places in Australia. So, you know, it was, I think that I always had an intention to want to see the world. And I think that if anyone has that intention, it doesn't matter where you are located, whether you're in the most remote area, whether you're in the middle of a city. If you really are passionate about learning from others and experiencing the world, you will make it happen. It's through a lot of focus and determination. A lot of support from friends and family and all these sorts of things. But I just want to encourage everyone to really think big. You know, like anyone can really go out and seize opportunities, and it's not beyond the reach of anyone. So I just want to maybe encourage people to just think outside, you know, their immediate environments, and don't be discouraged. Just keep going. If you really have a goal in mind for what you want to do, then you just keep doing it. You keep moving forward no matter what. So thank you.
Thank you very much for the closing statement. And then we're going to move on to another segment in the closing, which is the photo session. Please, for our dear participants who still hasn't turned on their camera, please do use this segment of the event to open your camera and do join us for the photo session, please. We'll wait. And for the operator, are you ready to take the photo for us?
Hi, Areta. Yes, I'm ready.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, I'm going to start from the first layer. 1, 2, 3. For the second layer, 1, 2, 3. And this is the third layer. 1, 2, 3. And the last one. 1, 2, 3. Okay, thank you so much, Areta.
Thank you so much, Mega. Then After all the sessions, we do still hope that our dear speaker and our dear participants to still enjoying the session, enjoying the lecture, but we unfortunately have reached the very end of this session of this afternoon. I'm very sorry about it, this afternoon. So we would like to, as me, especially as a part of the committee and the moderator for today, we would like to give our utmost gratitude once again for Ms.Katheryn Bennett and Ms. Jesselyn for participating, for giving us this enlightenment for our dear students around the world, around Indonesia. So thank you so much for participating in this event. And then we would like to remind our participants that we will have our next session in 1 p.m. and it is gonna be about batik. So it will be very interesting because a very deeply cultured focus session for batik and how we can develop and maintain it to be our national asset. So please do be anticipated for this session and see you on the next session. Thank you very much. Good afternoon for Ms. Katheryn, for Ms. Jesselyn, and for everyone. Thank you. See you all.
Thank you.
For our dear participants, we would like to give our gratitude once again. Thank you for being here. Hope you have enjoyed the session. And please, you may leave the room and please do join us for the next session. Thank you very much.